Why did American cars fail in Europe? The size? They're too big? Yeah, excited to get into this one. I have a couple of ideas, but it could be most likely, I'm assuming, like the biggest factor is the size, but there could be some other factors, maybe gas. Obviously, like our steering wheels are on opposite sides in different countries. Tariffs?
A tariff.
All right, I'm totally kidding. All right, let's hop into this one and see why American cars fail in Europe.
Why did American cars fail in Europe? Let's explore.
I don't know. Let's explore.
I'm sure you're all aware by now that American cars and American
that kind of looks like my
manufacturers
car.
simply couldn't take off in Europe. No matter how much they tried, two of the big three simply couldn't get enough people interested in their cars. Why did this happen? Well, the simple answer is they didn't do it properly. And that requires us to start with looking at the one automaker that did do it properly. Ford. Ford is, to all intents and purposes, an American automaker. However, when it came time to expand into the European market, Ford actually put a fair amount of thought into it. They did have a presence before that, but the Blue Oval's European outfit, aptly named Ford of Europe, was founded in 1967, merging the automaker.
I just gotta say one thing. This Escalade that they're showing us right here, this Cadillac, looks like an Escalade. This car looks badass. Holy shit. I want this car.
UK, Germany, and Ireland offshoots. That's the Republic of Ireland, by the way. In 1967, the first model to appear from this new merger was the original Transit, which would go on to become the literal face of vans in Europe, certainly the UK, and rightfully so. Ford of Europe
looks like a
continued
VW
to
bus.
do the European expansion properly by opening production facilities all over Europe. Today, the European arm of Ford operates 7 manufacturing facilities on the continent, in the UK, Germany, Romania, Turkey, and Spain. Ford also did this whole thing right by developing and designing cars specifically for the European market. The Fiesta, although they tried to market it to North America, which failed miserably, went on to become such a huge success in Europe that they
I know somebody that had one of those.
Year. Nice. Yes, I'm also
like the
bitter
old
about
Fiesta, not the.
But it
not
really
the
was
ones.
hugely successful in Europe, and the same applied to one of the C segment's darlings, the Focus. Ford's first crossover SUV
Ford
specifically
Focus.
designed for Europe, the Kuga, also did and still is doing great, and the same could be said of their Europe-specific minivans, the C-Max, the S-Max, and the Galaxy spelled with a Y at the end,
Never
by
seen
the way,
any of
which
those.
all showed the continent that minivans don't have to be boring. So there we are, Ford of Europe did everything correctly as far as an expansion to Europe is concerned, which is why they're still very successful here. So what happened to the other two? Let's start with everybody's favorite manufacturer of totally reliable cars, trust me bro, General Motors. Like Ford, General Motors also had a pretty substantial presence in Europe by the latter half of the 20th century. They had acquired Opel fully by...
You guys have a good amount of Teslas, don't you? Pretty sure you have a good amount of Teslas.
1931, and then in 1990, they acquired Saab and managed to destroy them in just 20 years. Great job. 4 years prior, in 1986, GM also officially formed General Motors Europe, which relegated GM's operations in Europe to Opel, Vauxhall, and then Saab. Now we arrive at the early to mid-90s. This was the time when another, seemingly unrelated, but actually very relevant to the story, automaker was entering the European market. Daewoo. Daewoo cars started to trickle into Europe in the 90s with a focus on value for money. The Tico, based on the 80s Suzuki Alto, was a beats-taking-the-bus type of vehicle, but it sold like hotcakes, especially in Formula
Sorry when you guys have
One
that
above that was the Nexia, which was a small, Golf-ish sized hatchback, and you could have a sedan too. At the top sat the Espero, which wowed journalists at the time for offering a ton of equipment for basically no money. Continuing into the late 90s, Daewoo's Lanos, Nubira, Evanda, which was also known under 10 different other names, and the horribly ugly Takuma were all doing fine in Europe.
Yeah, that
and
thing
then Daewoo
is
went bankrupt and General Motors scooped them up in 2002. With General Motors now at the reins of Daewoo, they devised one of the stupidest, most befuddling strategies I've ever heard. General Motors founded Chevrolet Europe in 2005 in Switzerland with the promise that the Chevrolet brand would return to Europe. However, there was a problem. The real Chevrolet's lineup back then was entirely unsuitable for the European market. The Avalanche, the Impala, the Silverado, the Blazer, you get the idea. Big
those
cars, even bigger engines, terrible gas mileage. None of these qualities are something that the average European buyer was looking for. So what did Chevy...
I gotta know one thing. Let me know in the comments. How much do you pay for gas? Whatever country you're watching this from. You can put it in your local currency. You don't have to put it in dollars for me. I can do that translation over myself. But yeah, just kind of curious what you guys do. Currently right now, I'm not too sure what our gas is. I normally don't pay attention to it. I just kind of like put it in and fill it up. It's probably because it's not that bad. I would imagine maybe like $2.25 a gallon, $2.25, maybe $2.50. It's usually always under $3. I think the highest I ever paid was about almost $6, and that's when I lived in California like 5 years ago. So
they rebranded Daewoo models from their Korean arm as Chevrolets and sold them in Europe. Yep, instead of doing the Ford thing and opening proper manufacturing facilities in Europe and designing cars specifically for the European market, Chevy just crossed out the letters Daewoo and wrote Chevrolet in Sharpie. And hey presto, new car. This resulted in abominations like the Chevy Spark, the Aveo, the Lacetti, the Captiva, and my personal nut favorite, the Orlando. Sure, you could still buy the Corvette and the Camaro in Europe, but these were meant to be Chevy's volume sellers. I think that the only somewhat good car to come out of this whole Daewoo bullshit was the Cruze. They were in Macedonia volume sellers because Macedonia is a poor-ass third world country and people needed cheap cars. Eventually, Chevrolet withdrew from the European market in 2013. By that point, GM had already shuttered Saab due to their bankruptcy issues a few years prior, leaving Opel as the only presence General Motors had in Europe, until Stellantis acquired Opel in 2017 and made them 15 times better, that is. So there we are. Chevrolet failed in Europe because the Chevrolets that most people were buying were just thinly disguised cheap Korean cars that were about as desirable as getting a sledgehammer to your face. That leaves us with the last remaining member of the big three, Chrysler. Originally, Chrysler had a decent presence in Europe thanks to the merger of Simca, Roots, and Barreiros. Apologies if I
video might be a little old.
And eventually, the PSA Group would continue selling Chrysler vehicles throughout the 80s badged as Talbots. Or at least I think so. That's all the sense I could make of the research I did online. It's a little complicated. So that technically means that Chrysler did the Europe presence thing properly at first. They rebadged various vehicles from the aforementioned brands, all of which were European, and sold them as Chryslers in Europe. That's fine. So what happened? Well, Chrysler was acquired by Daimler AG in 1998, leading to the creation of Daimler Chrysler. This gave Chrysler money, which they would eventually burn completely, and Daimler was losing so much money on Chrysler that they would sell them again in 2007. However, this also gave Chrysler a channel to re-enter Europe once again. And they did. Now, as I mentioned up there, GM's big mistake was convincing Europeans that they're buying a Chevrolet when they were in fact buying a Daewoo. In other words, they plucked cheap cars from their Korean arm and sold them to Europeans. So what was Chrysler's big mistake? Chrysler's big mistake was not bothering with basically anything. The relaunch in Europe featured the compact Neon, the Stratus midsize sedan, and the Voyager minivan, or as you may know it,
gosh, man, cars looked so bad in the 90s.
Sure, the Voyager offered a diesel engine and a manual transmission because Europe, am I right? The Stratus, which was actually a Dodge vehicle by the way, was available with either a 4-cylinder or a V6 engine. Remember, mid-size sedan in Europe.
I will say one thing about this video. He doesn't really have a lot of visuals. It's just like this car that's been driving around the whole time. I'd appreciate a little bit more visuals, but hey, what are you going to do? I'm not going to talk too much trash on another creator.
Europe in the 90s with no diesel power. Here's an interesting fact. The cops in Macedonia used the Stratus for the longest time as a patrol vehicle. And as far as I've heard, all but a few of them went memories up. And I'm pretty sure that nobody else except the police force actually bought them as civilian vehicles. Either that or they all exploded or destroyed themselves. I don't know. Chrysler's not bothering with basically anything continued well into the late 2000s. The widely hated Dodge Nitro was worse than other European SUVs in just about every way, and it was too big for
that's not really
it did receive a wagon version, which was just a Dodge Magnum with a front end swap.
Yeah,
and
these were pretty popular.
Mercedes
that Nitro, though, was ugly.
Competitors in just about every conceivable way. Chrysler even tried to sell the widely hated Sebring to European customers. Yes, that includes the convertible, too. Again, these were all vehicles designed for the American market, and Chrysler simply brought them over and updated them slightly to meet European regulations. They were practically unchanged from their American counterparts. And that's a problem because it's a well-known fact that American and European car buyer tastes are vastly different. Oh, how could I forget? Chrysler also tried selling the PT Cruiser in Europe. That went about as well as
oh my gosh, I hated these cars.
The writing was on the wall. The 300C completely lost to the E-Class A6 and 5 Series, which is hilarious because the 300C of that time was based on the E-Class. The Stratus, meanwhile, lost out to stuff like the Passat, the Honda Accord,
I've
the
never
Laguna,
owned a Ford,
the Mercedes C-Class, and so on.
a
The
Chrysler,
Jetta and
or a
GMC
GMC. Never owned any of those.
Around the Sebring, and every other European minivan, the VW Charan, the Ford S-Max and Galaxy, yes, they were made by Ford of Europe, it counts, the Peugeot 807 and its siblings kick the Voyager's ass 10 times over. Eventually, Chrysler just completely lost its mind and decided to continue its presence in Europe in an entirely new and balls-to-the-wall way. The second-generation Lancia Thema was the second-generation Chrysler 300C with a few Lancia badges,
That's
and
not
the
bad.
Lancia Voyager was the same thing but for the later town and country. I also realized I completely forgot to write in the script that Lancia models were sold as Chryslers in the United Kingdom for no reason that I can think of. There probably is a reason, probably a weird, unusual reason either way. They did the long walk of shame back to North America, and eventually they wound up selling to Americans all of 2 cars, one of which recently went out of production. Nowadays, Stellantis is focusing its efforts on other Mopar vehicles, and Chrysler is left with just a single model, the Pacifica minivan. But that one is pretty good from what I've read.
This looks newer.
That's okay.
This
And
is
those
like the
are the
recent,
reasons why American cars in Europe failed. Thank you so much for watching this video, everyone. If you liked it, be sure to hit like and subscribe to the channel.
Not the
If you have any
reasons
other
that I thought
reasons
it would
for this
be.
that I don't know about, or that are difficult to find on the internet, let me know in the comments below. And I will see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.
All right, not the reasons that I thought that you guys don't really have American cars over there. I mean, they touched on it a little bit of like the size, and they kind of like changed the models. Sent over some cars from the Korean cars, I guess, that Chrysler makes, and like trying to use those models. But he did mention bad gas, so let me know, you guys. Do you guys ever see American cars over there at all? I would imagine you got to see Teslas. Like, Teslas are pretty popular, especially with them being like the best electric vehicles, and most cars seem to be going in the electric direction. I would imagine that there's a fair amount of Teslas out there, like they are in Asia. But appreciate you watching it, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.